Well, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Alan Packwood, and I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archives Centre. The reason that I'm speaking about the Archives Centre this afternoon, rather than showing you the Archives Centre, is that, as many of you will know, we have our 50th anniversary celebrations coming up on Monday and Tuesday. And actually the team are in the middle of sort of preparing for this big conference. And I'll speak a little bit more about that at the end of my talk. But I thought this was an excellent opportunity for me to talk to you about the history of the Archive Centre. And I'm certain that there are going to be things that I can learn from you and your memories of it over the years. Now, normally when I mention the Churchill Archives Centre, people think of two things, I think. They think naturally enough of Winston Churchill and the fact that we have his papers, some 2,500 boxes, an estimated 1 million items, and 2 unsmoked Churchill cigars. The other thing that I think people know is that we have Margaret Thatcher's papers, complete with 1 prime ministerial handbag. Handbag that is about to go on loan to Cambridge University Library for their Spitting Image exhibition, where it's... But in fact, of course, as some of you will know, the Archive Centre is much, much more than these 2 collections. In fact, we have some 600 collections on site now. And I just want to give you an idea of the range of people whose papers we hold. So, and this is a chance for you to see if you can identify these individuals. This is Rosalind Franklin, who, of course, did amazing pioneering work into the structure of DNA. And we have her papers, including her key notebooks from 1951 to 53, when she was doing the sort of the key research in London. Another female scientist, this is Lisa Meitner, Austrian-born Jewish physicist, involved with the discovery of nuclear fission, for which she doesn't get enough credit. Partly because, of course, she was working in Nazi Germany and only fled at the very last moment, but she was subsequently overlooked for the Nobel Prize. Ernest Bevin, Minister of Labour in Churchill's wartime coalition cabinet, and thereafter Foreign Secretary during the early years of the Cold War in the Attlee administration. Michael Young, who was briefly a fellow of this college, a sociologist, produced his seminal work on family and kinship in East London, but then, of course, went on to do all sorts of incredible things. He's one of the driving forces behind the Open University, Consumers Association. Neil Kinnock, leader of the Labour opposition in the 1980s. So it's wonderful that we have his papers alongside Margaret Thatcher's. So the researchers of that era can come in and look at events from these 2 rather different perspectives. Admiral Ramsay, really interesting character, went both ways across the Channel during the Second World War. So he was the architect of the Dunkirk evacuation, but also the man responsible for planning Operation Neptune, which was the naval aspect of the D-Day landings in 1944. Field Marshal Lord Slim, who commanded British armies in Burma. Florence Horsburgh, who has the distinction of being the first female Conservative cabinet minister. She was Secretary of State for Education in Churchill's peacetime administration between 1951 and 55. And then one face that perhaps you won't recognize, this man is Vasily Mitrokhin. It's one of the more unusual collections that the Archive Centre has, but also perhaps one of the most famous. I like this collection because Metrokin was an archivist, but he was, of course, an archivist for the KGB. And as such, he was responsible for moving their foreign intelligence archive from its old headquarters building to a new headquarters, which meant that he had access to everything. And he'd become disillusioned, and he started systematically copying out documents that named KGB operations and operatives. And he did this for an incredible period, for about 12 years, smuggling these little handwritten notes out in the soles of his shoes or in his jacket pocket, at huge personal risk, obviously. I mean, any day he could have been caught and shot. And he assembles this huge copy archive underneath his dacha outside Moscow. And there it sits, because he can't really do anything with it until after the fall of the Soviet Union. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, he made his way to, well, initially, we're told, an American embassy in one of the Baltic states. But they were being swamped with people wanting to get out of the Soviet Union at the time, and so didn't take him seriously. He then tried his hand at the British embassy, where I think a third secretary sat him down, gave him a cup of tea, copied some of the documents, faxed them across to London, and was told there might be something in this. Ultimately, that led to Metrokin, his archive, and his family all being exfiltrated from Russia, which is a wonderful word, and brought over here, where Christopher Andrew, Cambridge-based academic, worked alongside Metrokin in publishing some of the material. And we were approached a few years ago and asked if we would take it and hold it, because it had been Metrokin's wish that ultimately it become available in a Cambridge archive. We don't have it all, and what we do have is quite heavily redacted. So it just gives you an idea of the range of collections. In terms of what we exist to do with these collections, well, I mean, the title of this talk gives it away. It's all about preservation and access. It's about preserving this material so that it's here, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. But it's also about making it available, because there is no point keeping this material unless people can use it. So this is our mission statement, which you will find up on our website. And what it makes clear is that we collect personal papers of people who've played a prominent role in the modern era. And particularly individuals who made and remade British domestic politics and international relations, advanced scientific knowledge, and who observed or transformed society, economics, and culture. So that's our collecting policy. What do we do with this material? Well, of course, we have to collect it, and that often means going out and surveying it in situ, visiting people's attics and basements, boxing material, and bringing it back into the Archives Centre. Once it's here, of course, we preserve it. We have wonderful state-of-the-art strong room facilities, environmentally controlled, security protected, and with a terrifying Inogen gas fire suppression system that should put out any fire without destroying the documents. It's supposed to be an inert system, so it should also do it without killing the staff, but it's the sort of thing that can keep me awake. But we have these wonderful strong room areas. We have a conservation workshop on site, and 2 paper conservators and a conservation assistant on the staff. And that's hugely significant for us, because it means that we can clean material, fumigate material if necessary, repair it, treat it, prepare it for exhibition, prepare it for digitization, and do all of that in-house without sending the material out elsewhere. We're able to catalogue the material. We have a team of 6 archivists who are busy behind the scenes working on the collections, and we then make it available in the reading rooms of the Archives Centre. And the Archives Centre is open to anyone who wants to come and use it. We're not an ivory tower locked away within the college, within the university. Anyone can make an appointment to come and consult the collections here. They just need to register with us and show some identification the first time they come. But of course, we're also working hard to make the material available outside the Archives Centre. We're we now have the ability to digitise material ourselves in-house. And one of the things that we started doing during the COVID pandemic was digitising files for those people who could no longer come and visit the Archive Centre in person. And we've continued doing that post-COVID. So we will actually do an hour's free research and an hour's free copying per person per month, which I think is we're very fortunate to have the resources to be able to offer that service. But of course, in doing that, we're digitising more and more of our own holdings all of the time. The Churchill papers have been digitised working with the publishers Bloomsbury, who brought you Harry Potter, so they've reinvested their Harry Potter money in Winston Churchill. They've digitised the papers, produced the Churchill Archive Online, which is a product they sell to other libraries and universities around the world, which then generates an income stream back to the Archive Centre. We continue to make the papers freely available here. And we also exhibit the material, and we stage a range of outreach events. So we will host lectures, conferences, symposia. We will encourage school groups and student groups to come in and work on the collections. And we are, as I mentioned earlier, about to celebrate our 50th anniversary. So the Churchill Archives Centre opened on the 26th of July, 1973. I don't know whether anyone in the audience was there, but if anyone was, then do come up and speak to me afterwards, because it'll be very interesting to hear your memories of that occasion. And it was opened by the then American ambassador, Walter Annenberg, in the presence of Clementine Churchill, Sir Winston's widow, and in the presence of His Royal Highness Prince Philip in his capacity as the college visitor and the Chancellor of the university. So that was 1973, but the origins of the centre, I think, predate the physical building. I don't think we'll ever know the precise moment at which the creation of the Archive Centre was first mooted, although Mark Goldie has traced it back as far as January 1963 to a conversation between Anthony Montagu Brown, Winston Churchill's final private secretary, and Churchill was still alive at that point, and Stephen Roskill, who was a senior research fellow here. And apparently Montagu Brown said to Roskill over dinner at college, "You do realise that the college may be getting Churchill's papers, don't you?" And I don't think the college had really thought about it that much before that point. It is, of course, clear that we owe our existence to a major politician who led his party, played a key role in leading the country through the Second World War, and became Prime Minister. I'm talking, of course, about Clement Attlee. Surely some mistake, I hear you cry. But no, Clement Attlee, not Winston Churchill, was the first major figure to give some of his papers to Churchill College, which he did in April 1965. And he gave 5 boxes of paper and correspondence, which means that he occupies the position of accession number 1 in our register of collections. And actually, it's some really interesting correspondence. He gave his papers relating to sort of his correspondence with Churchill. So, let me take you back to the 25th of March, 1965. Only a few months have passed since the death of Winston Churchill in January. His former private secretary, Sir Jock Colville, after whom the hall in the Archive Centre is named, has already played a key role for the college in raising the funding for the creation of the main college itself, and he now remains involved in our affairs as one of the founding trustees. And he sends a letter on the 25th of March, 1965, to Clement Attlee, whom he knows well, and under whom he's also served as a private secretary in Downing Street after the Labour victory in the 1945 election. And Colville writes to Attlee, "Churchill College, of which I am one of the trustees, are very much hoping that in due course the entire collection of the Churchill papers will be delivered to them for safekeeping, to serve as the basis of a research centre into the history of our affairs during this century. Leslie Rowan, who had also been one of Churchill's private secretaries during the Second World War, and I are the 2 trustees of the Chartwell settlement, and therefore legally the owner of the papers. And I think we should both be in favour of this. there is a sporting chance that Randolph, Sir Winston's son, who quite naturally wishes to see his father's papers kept together as one collection, would also be agreeable. And in the hope that in due course this happy conclusion can be reached, the college are proposing to provide accommodation on a generous scale for these papers. I hope and believe they will be housed in the Bevin Library, which is now nearing completion and which was a joint gift of the TUC and the TGWU, the Trades Union Congress and the Transport and General Workers Union. On the same day, Colville also wrote to Major Hamilton, the first college bursar, informing him of his initiative, which he said had been taken at the suggestion of Dr. Killen, the college librarian, and stating that he doubted there was a great hope of getting these papers, but that if by a chance Attlee did agree, I would also approach Anthony Eden, and I think we might also at some stage ask Dame Florence Bevin. In that event, we should already have a really remarkable collection. Well, we never got Eden's papers. They ultimately went to the Cadbury Research Library at the University of Birmingham. We did get a large part of Bevin's personal archive, the first tranche arriving in 1967. But no doubt to Colville's surprise, it was Attlee who responded first, giving us that small collection of his papers, including some of his key correspondence with Churchill. And it includes a wonderful exchange between Churchill and Attlee. It's January 1945. The coalition government is coming under increasing strain as they look towards the end of the war and they can see a general election coming. And Clement Attlee takes this opportunity to write a private and personal letter to Churchill, which he types out himself, 6 pages, in which he systematically sets out all the things he thinks that Churchill is doing wrong in running his cabinet. The fact that he's not reading his papers, he's not listening to ministers, he's rambling on points only sort of loosely connected with the business of the day. He's bringing in sort of senior Conservative figures from outside the cabinet. For 6 pages it goes on and on and on. Well, how do we think Churchill responded to that? This is the reply that Attlee received. My dear Lord President, I have to thank you for your private and personal letter of January the 19th. You may be sure I shall always endeavour to profit by your counsels. Yours sincerely, Winston S. Churchill. Interestingly, that's not the whole story, because we know that Churchill, we know from Jock Colville that Churchill was furious on receiving Attlee's letter, and that he actually sat down to write a point-by-point rebuttal. And we actually have that draft in the Churchill papers in the Archives Centre. But apparently, according to Colville, in the course of writing out that response, he picks up the phone and contacts Lord Beaverbrook and says to Beaverbrook, look at this, Attlee's written me this terrible letter. And to Churchill's surprise, Beaverbrook says, well, actually, there's probably something in this. Churchill slams down the phone, and at that point, I think Clementine Churchill comes into the room. Churchill regales her with the story of Attlee's letter, and she says something like, well, dear, I'm sure he's only doing what he thinks best for himself and his party colleagues. At which point, Churchill fires off this one-line reply and turns to Colville and says, let us think no more of Attlee or Hitley, let us go to the movies. And they went off to watch a film. So some wonderful correspondence. Sadly for us, the main body of Attlee's papers would later go to the Bodleian in Oxford. But at least having these 5 boxes allows us to say that we've always been bipartisan in our collecting. It also shows that some form of archives or research centre was envisaged from the college's very earliest years, with the related hope that Churchill's papers would come here and form the centrepiece. And the catalysts for that seem to have been the death of Churchill and the completion of the library. The prime movers in this enterprise were these 4 men, John Killen, the college librarian, John Cockcroft, the first master and, of course, Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Captain Stephen Roskill, former Royal Naval captain turned official historian of the Second World War at sea, and now a senior research fellow at the college, and Jock Colville, the former private secretary to 2 prime ministers and ultimately to Princess Elizabeth as well. Between them, these 4, I think, effectively established the collections policy that has dominated the first 50 years of the Archives Centre's history, bringing together under one roof the private papers of the politicians, the service chiefs, the diplomats, the civil servants, scientists and technologists who've shaped the history of our recent past. Colville knew the politicians and the civil servants and where the bodies were buried. Roskill knew the service chiefs, particularly the admirals, and Cockcroft knew the scientists. They were bound together by their wartime service and by their connection to the college, and they developed a shared mission which is summed up in a letter sent by Sir John Cockcroft in July 1967, when the idea of building a new archives was first being discussed. And Cockcroft wrote, "The aim of this venture is to make the college a major centre of historical research into what might be termed the Churchill era, where scholars will be able to find a great mass of interrelated material gathered together under a single roof." And that remains what we do. The early accessions of the Archives Centre certainly reflect the interests of those four, and perhaps especially Roskill's interest in naval history. You get a very real sense that he was the driving force in the early years. But these are some of the first individuals and collections to come into the Archives Centre. The centre was initially an adjunct to the college library, but as I've just indicated, there was always the ambition to become something much bigger. And the hope was, of course, that Sir Winston's own papers would form the centrepiece of the college collection. And that wish came a step closer in 1969, when Lady Spencer Churchill gifted her husband's post-1945 papers, which she owned, to the college. And that, of course, immediately posed the college with an interesting dilemma. If it was going to take in this material, how was it going to house it? How was it going to protect it? How was it going to conserve it? How was it going to make it available? And the college then began to look very seriously at the creation of a dedicated archive centre. And that task fell on Dr. Michael Hoskin, a fellow of the college and a prominent historian of astronomy, when he agreed to become fellow librarian. And he wrote, "In 1969, I received a phone call from the Vice Master of Churchill telling me that the college expected to be the repository of the papers of Sir Winston Churchill and inviting me to become librarian with a view to constructing an archive centre. The challenge was intriguing. The library, I found, was established and running, a service primarily to the undergraduates of the college. Behind the library office was a large interior room fitted out with motorised shelving, and here were kept the collections from the Churchill era that had so far been assembled. On a top floor was a large room with little contact with the outside world, and there dwelt the archivist. Soon he was to be joined by the conservationist that I appointed, an uneasy coexistence as the noise made by the conservationist frayed the nerves of the archivist." Hence the need, or one of the reasons for a need for a new building. And that room that he refers to is actually still our conservation studio above the library office. But a new building was clearly needed, and the primary task was to raise the funds. As Dr. Hoskin explained, it was Jock Colville who came up with the winning strategy. Many features of the college were gifts of allied governments, for the college was the national memorial to Sir Winston. But curiously, there was no American gift. And Jock conceived of the idea of approaching all the US ambassadors of the Churchill era, or their families, inviting them to contribute a share of the cost of an archive centre. And in this, he was successful, though an endowment of the building and staff was still a matter for the future. With the cost of the bricks and mortar assured, the college agreed to go ahead. And of course, when you go into the Jock Colville Hall now, you see the names of all of those ambassadors on the far wall. So Dr. Hoskin persuaded the college that the Archive Centre should be built at the heart of the campus. The design was then approved and construction commenced. The opening performed by Walter Annenberg on the 26th of July 1973. And Hoskin remembered it as a remarkable day, not least because Mr. Annenberg, on arrival at the college, eluded his Secret Service guards and presented himself to me at the Archive Centre itself when he should have been in the party welcoming the Duke's helicopter. So much scurrying around. Now, we do have photographs of that opening event. We don't have any film footage. But what we do have is some film footage from the BBC from the time of the opening of the Archives Centre. This is raw footage, so the first part of it is silent, and then when we get towards the end, you'll hear an interview with Michael Hoskin about the opening of the Archives Centre. You can see how much the oak's grown. This is Victor Brown, who was conservator of the Archives Centre for some 30 years. And that press that he's using there still sits in the conservation studio. So it would be very difficult to get it out, I think. The strong room door that you can see here is still there, and we still change the combination on a regular basis. We've actually gone backwards in terms of the technology for the shelves themselves, I think, because they had pneumatic push-button shelves. We now have ones that you have to turn to open. But I think that's probably better on health and safety grounds. And there's the Attlee letter that I showed a moment ago. And this is Dr. Hoskin.
Well, of course, no historian is satisfied with the printed record. One must go behind what was made public and see what was written in private, correspondence, notes, memoranda, and so on. But what we're trying to do here is to build up not just one single collection of papers, but to assemble together many collections which are interconnected. We have here, for example, letters written by Winston Churchill, but these are not in Winston Churchill's papers, they're in the papers of the person to whom they were sent. And so, by acquiring the papers of Winston himself and of his political and military and scientific contemporaries, we've established a whole network of interconnected archives so that historians will find one half of the correspondence in one collection and the other half in the other collection. And this is of great value to historians, and this is what we're trying to do.
Besides the value to historians, these items have a tremendous commercial value these days.
Yes, they do indeed.
How much are they worth, in fact?
Well, a collection of papers of a cabinet minister would certainly fetch thousands of pounds if offered on the open market. And individual letters by Winston Churchill signed by him command £100 or £200 each. And so in this room at the moment we have millions of pounds worth of papers, but these have all been given or lent to the college, and it's very generous of the owners that they've done this.
Of course, it's your responsibility to make sure that they are safe. How much of a headache is security to you?
It's not a real headache, provided one thought out everything ahead of time. We believe that we've taken every possible safeguard, we've consulted the proper authorities in every case, and we feel that we've done everything that is reasonably possible, and some of the things which are not entirely reasonable also.
Now, you do have this private section in the archives where perhaps sensitive or very personal documents are kept. What is in the private section?
Well, any official papers which a cabinet minister takes home and which happen to be included eventually in his own private papers, would of course be closed for as long as the 30-year rule applies to them. And then there may be other documents of a still more secret nature, which the Lord Chancellor may keep closed for a longer period still. But most of the collections which are closed in part are papers which just refer to other human beings and give away perhaps their less favorable elements, love letters and so on. We must feel all the time that the people who entrust their papers to us have their trust honored.
There you have it. The clothes and the hairstyles have changed, but the questions that the journalists ask are still very much the same. What's the material worth, and where's the secret stuff? Okay, so Archives Centre opens in 1973. The Churchill papers are then transferred into the centre, including all of Churchill's pre-1945 papers, which remain in the possession of a family trust. And of course, it is an incredible collection, just to give you a few choice items, this is one of Churchill's school reports from St George's School in Ascot, 1884. He's 9 years old, and you can see there that you've got, under diligence, conduct has been exceedingly bad. He's not to be trusted to do any one thing. And then at the bottom, under general conduct and headmaster's remarks, you've got very bad, is a constant trouble to everybody and is always in some scrape or other. He cannot be trusted to behave himself anywhere. Yet they have to sort of grudgingly admit that in spite of this, he has made decided progress and that he does have very good abilities. I think you're seeing sort of the origins of Churchill's sort of willfulness and stubbornness in the child. We do have some amazing documents. What I love about archives, and we're talking to some of you about this just before this session, is the way that they sort of plunge you back into the past. They let you see events unfolding. They let you see thought processes at work. And that's what you're seeing here in this draft for one of Churchill's speeches. So this is his speech of the 11th of September, 1940. And you can see that he will have dictated, the duty secretary set it down in normal typescript, and then he's going through, making changes, alterations, annotations. You can look at what he's putting in, what he's taking out. Is it to do with the sound of the speech? Is it because of some new information, and so on? And you can see how these famous speeches are created. When the speech was more or less in its final form, it was taken away and retyped in this format at about A5 size, so that it would fit comfortably into his jacket pocket or into his hand. It would be tagged together so that he can't lose his place. And then the text is set out on the page in this blank verse format, which his office called speech form. Others have referred to it as psalm form because of the sort of Book of Psalms. But of course, when you see it on the page like this, you can immediately understand why Churchill did this, because it gives him the rhythm of the speech. It gives him the emphasis. It gives him the pauses. But even here, you can see last-minute changes and annotations. And this is the final page of his famous Finest Hour speech of the 18th of June, 1940. So the previous page has ended. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. So it's wonderful to have these sort of iconic documents. Of course, the real strength of the Archives Centre is in the whole and the body of material and the ability to sort of to go through on an almost day-by-day basis. But this opportunity does allow me to sort of just present one of my favourite Churchill documents. So this is December 1931. Churchill is in New York for a lecture tour. And he decides that he wants to go off and visit his friend Bernard Baruch on Fifth Avenue. He can't remember where Baruch's apartment is. He's going up and down Fifth Avenue, getting crosser and crosser. Eventually, he thinks he sees the building. He orders his car to stop. He storms out and is immediately hit by a car coming in the other direction. That classic British mistake in America of looking the wrong way. Fifth Avenue was two-way at this point. What's Churchill's response to that? Well, his response is to write up what it's like to be hit by a motor car and to syndicate that around the world. But he also, I think, dictates, because I think you can almost hear him dictating this note, to a doctor, Otto Pickhardt, who's summoned to Churchill's bedside. And what you've got here is, this is to certify that the post-accident convalescence of the Honourable Winston S. Churchill necessitates the use of alcoholic spirits, especially at mealtimes. The quantity is naturally indefinite, but the minimum requirements would be 250 cubic centimetres. And Churchill has written here, keep on hand. And of course, the reason he's written that and the reason he's keeping it on hand is, this is 1931, it's New York, it's Prohibition. So here's Churchill using his accident to actually earn himself some money for a newspaper article and to bypass Prohibition. But once the Archives Centre had the Churchill papers, it had the space to expand, and expand it did. And because, of course, there was now a separate archive centre, it also made sense for them to be managed separately. So the post of Keeper of the Archives Centre was created, and the first holder of this new office was the military and industrial historian Corelli Barnett. He took up his responsibilities on New Year's Day 1977, little knowing that he would remain in office for the next 18 years and lead a large and sustained expansion of staff, public services, and collections. And just to give you an indication of what life was like in the early years of the Archives Centre, this is an interview that we've recorded recently with Claire Brown, who was one of the very early archives assistants.
Hello, I'm Claire, and I worked here between 1978 and 1980. I was the second archive assistant at Churchill Archives. I heard about the post here, actually at the job centre. It looked interesting and I applied, and Captain Roskin interviewed me. And all I can remember of that interview is him asking me what I thought was the value of women's education. And it was an extraordinary question, really. But I simply said I imagined that he'd educated his daughters, and he didn't follow it up. I got the job. It was new in the sense of a concept of archives, and I knew that it would be a place where I would learn. I was very definitely a college servant. I had my staff gratuity in cash in a small brown envelope at Christmas. An average day for me, as the archives assistant, was front of house reader services. There was just me. I was fetching files, I was doing any photocopying, I was reshelving material, dealing with readers. There was no conservation advice, there were no book rests, foliation that passed through my hands and then it went up to conservation. So I was just part of a process. And it was, in a sense, a fairly industrial process. The thing which was really impressive for me was meeting so many people who had that connection with the immediate past, with great events in British history. That's the wonderful thing about working in archives. You build up your own personal jigsaw from the collections you've worked on, and they become like family friends. You feel you know them, you've read their letters, you've read their diaries. What I began here as a very naive, unqualified person has become something really special.
So the pre-1945 Churchill papers were here, although they remained in the ownership of a private family trust. Now Sir Winston was gradually surrounded by other faces, some familiar, some new, as the centre acquired the archives of Lord Duncan Sandys, Lord Hailsham, Field Marshal Lord Swillet Limb, Lord Selwyn Lloyd, Admiral Lord Fisher, Sir John Colville, Lady Spencer Churchill, Lord Brockway, Lord Noel Baker, Lord Todd, Lord Soames, Sir Ove Harrop, Sir Herman Bondi, Neil Kinnock, Rosalind Franklin, and many, many more. But the long-term future of the Churchill papers, the core collection, had still not been secured. And complex negotiations now took place over many years behind the scenes. So to quote Corelli Barnett, along with fundraising, the major anxiety of my keepership lay in the uncertain future of the Chartwell papers, Sir Winston Churchill's papers from childhood to 1945. From 1988 onwards, the Archives Centre and the college found themselves caught up in complex negotiations between a Churchill family trust and the government over the possible purchase of the papers by the state. The centre invited inspection by the Cabinet Secretary and by the National Heritage Memorial Fund and was validated as, in every respect, a worthy permanent repository for the Chartwell papers once a settlement had been reached. But that settlement took time to reach. Dr. Piers Brendan took over as keeper in time for the final stages of the negotiations, and in 1995 the papers were finally bought for the nation from the Chartwell Trust for £12.5 million, with a further £1.75 million coming to the Archives Centre for cataloguing, conservation and endowment, and that money was invested in a new charitable trust, the Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust, which continues to hold those papers on behalf of the nation. So in total, £13.25 million came from the newly established Heritage Lottery Fund. And if I've made those negotiations sound easy, let me assure you they were not. I've spoken in detail to Bill and Piers about their experiences and to some of those involved for the Cabinet Office, and I can confirm that they were all scarred by the experience. I think one day a book will be written detailing about how the collection was nearly broken up and lost at that point. But the aftermath of the lottery purchase saw the staff of the Archive Centre double in size in order to undertake an ambitious 5-year programme to conserve, catalogue and display the papers. Software was purchased and modified for this formidable task, and it was at this point, 28 years ago, that I first arrived on site, a young, green, naive archivist with little understanding of the complexities into which I was walking. Over the course of the next 5 years, the papers were catalogued and major Churchill exhibitions were staged at the Public Record Office in London, the John Rylands Library in Manchester, the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, and in addition, a rolling display of documents was set up at the Cabinet War Rooms, now the Churchill War Rooms, beneath Whitehall. But all the time, of course, other collections were coming in as well. And perhaps most important of all was the acquisition of the papers of Baroness Thatcher, first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. The papers arrived in 1997, though discussions had actually begun years before. Corelli Barnett recalled the initial contact was in 1993, and he wrote, "I was invited by a mutual friend of myself and the Thatchers, Mr. Ron Gerard, to talk informally about the life of a writer to a private luncheon he was giving at the Carlton Club. There I was introduced to Dennis Thatcher, who expressed interest in the fact that I was keeper of the Churchill Archives Centre. Only the previous evening, he told me, he and Margaret had been arguing as to whether Churchill College was in Oxford or Cambridge. I was able to assure him that Churchill was indeed a Cambridge college, whereupon he accepted my open invitation to himself and Lady Thatcher to visit the Archive Centre. And of course, in due course, they both came, followed by the papers and by the appointment of a dedicated archivist to catalogue them. And those papers are now the property of a charitable trust established and initially chaired by Lady Thatcher. I think it's fair to say that there's an official and an unofficial reason why we were favoured as the repository for the Thatcher papers. The official reason was her great admiration for Winston Churchill, which I don't think anyone doubts. The unofficial was the fact that Oxford had very publicly turned her down for an honorary degree, which I think knocked the Bodleian off pole position. But the arrival of the Thatcher collection, complete with one handbag, coming fast upon the acquisition of other sizable collections, took the existing Archive Centre strong room to capacity, and it necessitated the advent of a new building project. 4 stories of purpose-built archival storage at the back of the Wolfson Lecture Theatre, so just over there, and now known as the new wing of the Archive Centre. Dennis Thatcher visited the college on the 19th of July 2001 and formally cut the turf for this new building. What I remember is that there was lots of discussion about whether or not he would be allowed to smoke, and if so, where. I think in the end, he was given special dispensation to smoke in the Master's Lodge. Construction of the new wing commenced in August and finished in June 2002, thereby trebling the capacity of the existing archive centre and allowing it to continue to collect and to grow. And we still have space today, though the building is now about 75% full. The Archive Centre also used the opportunity of the new wing to upgrade and improve its existing facilities, expanding the reading rooms, installing a lift. And Margaret Thatcher cut the tape on the 30th of October 2002. And I find that a very difficult picture to look at simply because I've aged. My job on that occasion was to hand her the scissors. Now, I made sure that I had the scissors. I made sure that the scissors were shiny and clean. I made sure that the blade was in the palm of my hand so that I wasn't mistaken for an assassin by the snipers on the roof opposite. But what I forgot was that there was actually tape on both sides of her, leading to a sort of an awkward moment as she turned to cut it. And what she did was she turned to the press corps and the cameras that were all gathered there, and she said, "They're asking me whether I should go right or left." Okay, and so we move inexorably towards the present. I'm particularly wary of talking about the last sort of 25 years or so, as they're the decades with which I've been most closely associated with the Archive Centre. They're also a period well known to many of you. Suffice it to say that the centre has continued to expand. We're now a staff of 15, administering some 600 collections with endowments of some 16 million. By all measures, including number of researchers, we're bigger than we were. The Churchill papers have been microfilmed, digitised, and twice exhibited in the United States. The Thatcher papers have been catalogued, and those of Gordon Brown have been promised. The centre has achieved accredited status with the National Archives, and the Churchill Papers collection has been inscribed on the UNESCO International Register of the Memory of the World. But our collections continue to grow in all areas. Recent politicians include Lord Carrington, Patricia Hewitt, Ernest Marples, Philip Gould. Among the recent scientists are Afeni Donald, Bob Edwards, Aaron Klug, and John Murig Thomas. And a new area of collecting has opened up in the social sciences, comprising the papers of Michael Young, Phyllis Wilmot, and Paul Barker, among others. And then, of course, there's the Matrokin collection, the rare example of the papers of a Russian spy ending up in Cambridge rather than the other way round. All of this is down to the work of a wonderful team of professionals and specialists, ably supported by the Archives Committee and the trusts that I've mentioned, and by our many patrons and supporters. And I've not even mentioned the many Roskill lectures, conferences, events, and the Archives Byfellows who we've had using the collections since the 1980s. But what I wanted to do is to just show you, again, a couple of short videos, a couple of my colleagues, introduce a couple of members of the team, and get them just to, as we can't take you into the Archive Centre today, let them bring something of the Archive Centre to you. This is David Parker, who is our newest conservator.
Hi, I'm David Parker. I'm one of the conservators here at the Churchill Archives Centre. The item I've chosen for 50 Stories for 50 years is from my Lees Meitner collection. In amongst all the correspondence, there's a number of objects, mostly medals and awards. In amongst those are also her original slide rule. And I chose this object mainly because of provenance, but also because it's such a beautifully crafted object. For the actual box, it's called a clamshell box, hence because of the fact it looks like a clamshell. And this is made from archival quality box board, which is corrugated. And although it's quite light, it's also very strong indeed. It doesn't actually affect the items it's holding. And to support the slide rule in the case, we also use something called plastizote, which is an inert foam, so nothing can chemically interfere with the original objects. So with this small cotton tape tab, we can actually remove it from the enclosure, like so. And as you can see, it's a beautifully crafted object made out of hardwood, bone, and a piece of acrylic on top. So back in the day before the advent of silicon chips, this would have been the go-to instrument for making calculations. And it's amazing to think what discoveries have been made by using this beautiful slide rule.
Okay, and next we have Madeline Evans, who recently finished cataloguing the papers of Professor Bob Edwards, who of course won his Nobel Prize for his pioneering work on IVF. And we're thrilled to have not just his papers, but also the papers of his personal secretary, as Madeline will explain.
Madeline Evans, I'm one of the archivists here at Churchill Archives Centre, and the object that I've nominated for the 50 Stories for 50 Years is this scrapbook which belonged to Barbara Rankin. Barbara Rankin was Bob Edwards' secretary from 1969 until 1987, and that covers the period of the first success of IVF, the birth of the first IVF baby, and the establishment of the first ever IVF clinic. So she was working for him at a really exciting time, and luckily for us, she kept a series of scrapbooks. So this one is from 1978, which is the key time when the first IVF baby was born. I really like the annotations which Barbara Rankin's added into the scrapbook around photographs and around documents, just giving you a bit of context, and they're quite humorous, and they let you know what it was like to work for Bob Edwards. It says 2 phones, often both used by him at the same time, so those are on the desk. Note reel of sellotape on desk for cutting and sticking. Edwards' favourite method of altering manuscripts. His skill was considerable. He would not allow dusting or any open windows to blow paper. Jeannie's plants, so that's referring to Jean Purdy, who was another of the IVF pioneers. So her plants on the windowsill and top of Edwards' bookcase. The notice pinned on the bookcase said, "Books were property of Edwards and not to be removed." And she also sticks in little notes which tells you about how Barbara Rankin was feeling. For example, this fragile note that she found, and at the time she was typing up dictated audio tapes that Bob Edwards was sending her to write up for a textbook on human fertility.
Okay. So, what are the challenges of the future? Well, no doubt the future contains a lot of unknown unknowns, but among the known issues that we're starting to wrestle with are the following. An ageing building, 50 years old, with air conditioning plant that is not particularly flexible, efficient, or environmentally friendly. A need for more space, but possibly a different kind of space, as more and more of the personal papers we collect become digital rather than paper. A need to diversify our collections. We've always been an archive of the elite, one that I think I've shown was consciously created by that elite, but we need to move with the times. That elite used to be almost exclusively white and male, but things are finally starting to change, and we need to make sure that our collecting policy keeps pace. We need to be more proactive in collecting the papers of female and black and ethnic minority politicians, civil servants, diplomats, scientists, and social scientists. And I'm pleased that 2 of our most recent large accessions have been the papers of Patricia Hewitt and Baroness Trumpington. We need to keep up with new methods of delivering content online and through social media. We need to work with academics here in Cambridge and elsewhere to make sure that our collections are reaching researchers and students. And again, this is an area where we've been reactive in the past, encouraging the researchers to come to us, and where I think we can be more proactive in the future in establishing sort of joint initiatives with university departments here and elsewhere. But all of that, of course, is going to require resources. The Archive Centre is funded from its own endowments and from philanthropic grants and donations. The challenge will be sustaining those in a post-COVID era of austerity. Also in an era where fundraising on the Churchill name will not be so easy going forward. Partly, I think, because he is passing out of living memory, and partly because he is a much more controversial and divisive figure than he was even 5 years ago. But I don't want to end on a negative note. Overall, I think the Centre is in a much stronger position than many other archival repositories. It has a fantastic and in many cases long-serving and experienced staff. It has a wealth of wonderful collections with real strength in depth. It has its own endowment funding, and above all, and this I think is the most important point, it exists within an organisation that values learning and research, and so which supports the activities of the Archive Centre. So there you are, 50 years in just over 50 minutes. And I've inevitably only scratched the surface. For those of you who are alumni of Churchill, the Archives Centre is part of your college. You are already part of its collections because we have the college archive, which includes your tutorial files. But we would also, encourage you to come and use the archive, and also perhaps to think about whether you've got anything to contribute to that college archive. But, as I hope I've made clear, it is an archive that is for use by everyone. As it says on the back of the new wing, a rich inheritance to be enjoyed and used by all. So do come and see us. We have our 50th anniversary conference taking place on Monday and Tuesday of this week. It's not too late. It's free and open to anyone who wants to come. You can also watch the sessions online. We're going to be talking in more depth about the early years of the Archive Centre. We're going to be bringing back some of the researchers who've used the collections to talk about to get them to revisit their research and see what they might want now to add to it. And we're going to be looking to the future. So the programme is available on the college website. You'd be very welcome at all or any of it next week. Thank you very much. I think we do have a little time for questions, and we've got a roving mic because we are recording all of this. So, we have a question from a gentleman in the middle up here.
You mentioned the Bodleian. What are the other competing repositories? How would you characterise that competition?
Okay, I think I got so the question. I'll repeat the question just for the reason we ask you to wait for the roving mic is just because we are recording it. So, but the question was really the fact that I mentioned the Bodleian and what other competing institutions are there. Well, I suppose the first thing I would say is maybe competing is just fractionally too strong in that we are all part of a national archival framework. And of course, we do work alongside the Bodleian. And Richard Ovenden, the Bodleian librarian, is actually coming here on Tuesday to give the closing keynote of the conference. And the Bodleian, and as I'm sure you know, does have a wealth of modern collections and the papers of a number of modern prime ministers, including Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, and so on. So obviously, there is an interest, or we have an interest in working very closely with them. But there are a number of institutions that also collect personal papers. There are some other university repositories. So I mentioned the University of Birmingham. They have Eden and Chamberlain's papers. University of Hull, interestingly, has quite a good collection of modern political papers. For military papers, of course, there's the Imperial War Museum, the National Army Museum, the National Maritime Museum. And for scientific papers, there would be the Science Museum and also the Royal Society. And I suppose, the thing about personal papers, of course, is that it is very much up to these individuals to decide where they want their papers to go. And so that does mean that quite a big part of my job is going out, talking to people, making them aware of the Churchill Archives Centre and trying to persuade them to place their papers here. We don't have a budget to purchase material. And I would much rather use the funding that we have in the archive for the Archive Centre to fund the work on conservation, cataloguing, digitisation, and access. So we encourage people to give their papers, or where they're not able to give their papers, perhaps to give them in lieu of inheritance tax or in lieu of tax.
Mine is a very basic question. We know that paper and parchment can properly conserved endure for hundreds of years. Digital. What does digital mean from our archivist point of view? We recently had, WhatsApp exchanges from COVID. What does digital mean in your opinion?
It's a really good question. And it's a question that I wish my digital archivist was standing here to answer. He will give you a much better answer than I'm about to give. But in broad terms, of course, the principles in terms of archiving digital material remain the same as with paper, in terms of what you're trying to do is to preserve it and to make it accessible. But with the paper materials, we can store them in optimum conditions, in acid-free boxes and folders. We lock them up in our strong room, and we can be confident that they're going to be there in the morning, and that if we store them properly, that they'll be there for 100, 200 years, and maybe more. Although some of our papers, of course, are modern papers, which tend to be mass manufactured and quite acidic, and so interestingly are probably not as good in preservation, or certainly aren't as good in preservation terms as earlier handmade papers. But to come back to the digital, I mean, the problem that you've got with digital, one of the problems is, of course, the fact that everything could disappear in a nanosecond. So to counter that, you have to have very elaborate systems of backup in place. And we've just invested a lot of money in a digital preservation management system. We're working with a company called Limnova, which allows us to ingest this electronic material, has been deliberately designed and developed to cope with a huge range of formats, so JPEG, TIFF, PDF, Word, all of the sort of standard formats, allows us to ingest that material. We'll constantly monitor that material, and therefore will give us a warning if anything is being corrupted. We'll do this securely, but we'll also allow us to access it for the purposes of cataloguing and processing, and we'll do that, in a way that doesn't corrupt the material. But it is a huge area, not just for this archive, but obviously for all archives and libraries, and is one that we will be discussing more at the conference on Monday and Tuesday. Okay, so is there a question at the back?
A good proportion of the government papers that are sent to the National Archives are weeded out because they're not worth keeping. Do you do any weeding, and how do you decide what to keep and what to ditch?
It's, again, a hugely complex issue. I would say the first thing that we do is that we would work with the depositor. So we would normally go out and we will survey the material in situ. And then, well, this is the ideal way of doing it. It hasn't always been possible to do that during COVID. But we would go out, we would survey the material, and then we can sit down with the depositor and we can go through what they have and assess its historical significance. There may be things that the family want to retain as heirlooms. There may be things that the family would not be prepared ever to make available. And there is no point the Archive Centre taking in material if it can never make it available. Obviously, in those situations, we would always try and convince the depositor that actually it made sense for the material to come in, and that we would keep it closed under data protection for the duration of their lifetime and for the lifetimes of those people who were directly involved if it was sensitive material. So there are those sorts of discussions that are taking place around sensitivity. We, on the whole, don't take in printed, published material that would be available elsewhere. So if we will take the archive, but not the library in many cases. And we won't necessarily take in printed papers if they're already going to be here and available in Cambridge. But on the whole, what we're trying to do is to capture the entire life and career of that individual. And I think that means increasingly that we err on the side of caution and err on the side of taking more rather than less, because it's very difficult to predict what the research trends of the future are going to be and what materials people are going to be interested in. And there may be sort of elements of research that simply haven't occurred to us, that someone in the future may well be extremely interested in sort of analysing routine financial documents, for example. So we tend to on the side of caution now. Okay, so we've got 2 questions over here, I think. So the lady 3 rows down, and then Trevor at the back afterwards.
You've naturally spoken chiefly about paper materials. Do you have an audio archive, or are there audio elements to the archive you have?
There are audio elements, but it's far more paper and photographs than anything else. We haven't sort of systematically set out to sort of collect audio archives, and there are other repositories that are much better equipped and more specialist to do that. But of course, where people have amongst their personal papers recordings of interviews that they've given, and also a certain amount of film footage, we will take that in and accession that as part of the collection. With the film footage, what we will do now is to digitize it and to freeze the original film. A lot of the audio we've also been digitizing, and actually you can listen to a certain amount of it now online through the Archives Centre's new open access portal, which is another thing that we've launched as part of the 50th anniversary. So there is audio and video, small amounts of it sort of scattered through the collection. Where we have done something more is with oral history, and Paula is sitting here, Paula Laycock, who has actually sort of has been the driving force behind the college's oral history program, a program to go out and interview former fellows and members of staff, not just former fellows, existing fellows as well. And we've built up a huge audio library of their memories. We also host the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme, which is a programme run alongside the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is to interview former ambassadors and diplomats at the end of their careers. We don't make the recordings available because the FCO need to vet them, but we make the transcripts of those recordings available through our website. And in the 1970s, 80s, the Archives Centre conducted an oral history programme to interview many of the people who'd worked for Churchill, private secretaries, personal secretaries, literary assistants, and so on. And we have a very good oral history of that material. And one other collection, actually an oral history relating to the Ove Arup architectural practice. We have interviews with many of the people who worked alongside Ove Arup as part of his collection. So there's actually more than you think once you start to put it together.
Thanks, Fran.
You mentioned that Winston has become a more controversial person in the last few decades. Mm-hmm. Can we take the fight to some of this controversy by looking at the fact that in many contexts he was decades ahead of his time in non-racial attitudes? He was arguing with the Boers for the development of a future South Africa where the black man was equal with the white in Edwardian times. In 1943, he wrote to Tommy Lascelles that the 2 million Indian troops were in no way to be thought of as inferior troops. They're every bit our equals and our brothers in arms. Now, there's probably a lot more material like that, which I don't know. But can we please start challenging this controversy about the greatest man in history for the last 500 years?
Well, I mean, the great thing about the Churchill Papers collection is its richness, its strength and in depth and breadth. And of course, it is open and available to everyone here to come in and to look at it and to draw their own conclusions from that material. And that's what we exist to do. We exist to preserve the material. We exist to make it available to the widest possible audience. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem with the debate about Churchill now is that it's not really a debate about Churchill. It's a debate about what's going on in the world today. And Churchill is used as a lightning rod. He's used because he generates headlines. If you attach a story to Winston Churchill, you're guaranteed the front cover of the Daily Mail. And this is all sides in the debate. In today's debates, we'll use Churchill in that way. And of course, what you lose in that, and what you lose in a debate that is being conducted largely through social media, is the complexities and the nuance. And that's what the archive here is. That's what it gives you back. And I absolutely agree with you, Trevor, that what we should be doing, and what I'm trying to do in my own research, and I think what the Archive Centre is trying to do, is to tell the full story. I don't think anyone would say that Churchill got everything right. And he is a character of incredible complexity and contradiction, partly because it's such a long political career, but also because he was an incredible, complex character, and he wasn't averse to changing his mind. Here's someone who said that he'd often had to eat his words, and on the whole, he'd found it a wholesome diet.
Sorry, totally separate question. As you and I know, I've given you a few small items from my family's collection of odd bits to do with World War II. Do you have lots of people that you would like that are giving stuff to you? Would you find it useful to have lots more people giving you the odd little thing they find?
Always interested to know what's out there. I can't guarantee that everything fits within the collection here. It would have to fit within the Archive Centre's collecting policy. But as I said earlier, we do also see ourselves as being part of something bigger, being part of a larger national archival framework. And so I think we have a duty and a responsibility to help find homes for material that we're not going to take in ourselves. So if someone comes to me with something that I don't think fits here, then we won't just turn them away. We'll have a think about, well, where should that material go? Should it be in a local record office? Should it be at the Science Museum? Should it be at the National Army Museum? Or wherever. So I would certainly encourage people not just to throw things away, but definitely to come forward. And in terms of your own experiences here in Cambridge and at Churchill College, we're certainly looking for material to add to the college archive that complements the interesting but rather sort of dry committee records. What we want is to know what it was like to be here at Churchill College in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and so on. So our college archivist, Hannah James, certainly very interested in hearing from all of you if you've got photographs, if you've got material that you kept from your time here. And, Trevor, you've been incredibly generous in bringing in really quite rare books, the sort of thing that you wouldn't now find in a bookshop. And where we've got books like that we're not going to find elsewhere that relate to the Second World War period or the Cold War period, yes, or relate to the areas covered by the Archive Centre, we would definitely be interested in taking them and adding them to the Roskill Library.
So thank you very much for a wonderful talk. So my question was about the clientele of the Archives Centre. So are you finding, we're living in an era where open access is becoming more and more the expectation, and where the sort of general democratisation of the availability of more material, knowledge in general, but also source material. So I wondered if you're seeing a change in the clientele, people who are accessing the archive, and if you're, and what kind of change you're anticipating in that, and also how the way in which people access the archive is changing, and that you expect that might change.
Those two things, of course, are very linked, because what we are seeing is more and more people accessing material remotely. And I think it's certainly true to say that COVID accelerated that trend. And one of the silver linings of COVID, if you can say that there are such things, is that we were able to adapt our service so that we can now supply material remotely far more easily, far more flexibly. In the past, researchers really, by and large, had to come to the Archive Centre to see the material. Now they can access the catalogues online, they can identify the material that they want to see, and they can email us, and we will then digitise material and send it to them. Going forward, the way that trend will develop is we will, as we digitise more and more material, we will start to make it available directly to them ourselves through our own open access portal, and by expanding that. So that more and more of this information will be available on screen. I think that obviously takes the material potentially to a much wider audience, and it particularly, I think, encourages use by school groups who wouldn't otherwise necessarily have been able to come into the Archive Centre, so that is really good. What you lose, perhaps, in that is really the ability when you're coming in and you're looking through a file of material, just the luck of thinking, well, what's the next thing in the box, and looking at that, and then that leading you off in a new direction. So I think what archives have to think about is how do you replicate that experience online for the researchers, and clearly there's got to be more thought in that, but increasingly more and more will be made available online, more and more will be available remotely. That will widen the audience, but I think there will always be the core researchers will always, I think, want to come in to the Archive Centre and want to spend time going through the collections. So I don't think it will lead to an end to the reading rooms. What I think it will lead to is sort of a two-tier system in a way, where a lot of material is available online and easily accessible, but that if people still want to come in and do the detailed research and going through the boxes themselves, they should have the ability to do that. And I think it's important that we don't lose that. Sorry, that's a rather clumsy answer to your question, but
that's wonderful. Thank you very much. And the thing you just said about school groups really reminds me, when I was at school in Coventry, then we had a trip into the local archive centre in the centre of town, and we were given some artefacts to look at. And the one I was given was the diary of a night watchman, lots of boring entries. And I turned a page, and suddenly there was a handwritten account of the Coventry Blitz on the next page. And that kind of experience of actually seeing the material firsthand is very hard to replicate in any other context.
It is, and of course, I suppose the other shift that you will see is that more and more of this material will be born digital. And that will also, I think, change the nature of the engagement with the material.
Thank you.
Okay, we should probably bring it to a close there, I think, shouldn't we? Is that?
If there aren't any more.
Yep.
Oh, is there one more? No. Is that?
Okay, in which case, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. Do come and see us.